Hey there, this is Jess from Make and Do Crew, and I've partnered with Lion Brand to show you how to deconstruct any yarn cakes like mandala and combine them to form your own gradient in any crochet or knitting pattern that you wish. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to choose which colorways to combine, how to deconstruct your cakes, and then exactly how to plan out your gradient row by row so that you have something at the end that you're really happy with. And if you love learning new crochet techniques like this, I'd be psyched if you gave this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. So this is the technique that's used in my remix cardigan pattern, and you can find that for free on makeanddocrew.com, and I'll link to it right below this video. And I just want to clear something up right away because I know you may be wondering, there's really not a ton of ends to weave in at the end of doing something like this, as long as you crochet over your yarn tails as you go. So I was really inspired to try this out after seeing a couple people on Instagram do something similar with their yarn cakes, and I'm going to link to those accounts right below this video as well, because I think it's really cool to see how a similar technique can take a different shape with a different pattern or a different project or just a different crocheter's artistic spin on it. So the project that I'm using as the example, I used two different colorways of the traditional original Lion Brand Mandala yarn. So this one is called Warlock, and it kind of created like the shadow shades of each color and added some depth. And then this one is called Pegasus, and again, that's from the original Mandala line. But what is so cool is that now Lion Brand has come out with a couple of other yarns that are the exact same weight and fiber content. So really, when you're planning your gradient, you could use any of these yarns and kind of mix and match to find colors that you feel like are complementary, and they'll just kind of be seamless throughout because these are so similar. So this one is the baby line of mandala, and it offers some really fun colors and also some good neutrals. This is just a really nice varied complement to the original mandala. And then this is a new yarn called Cupcake, and like I said, it's the same composition as any of the mandalas. So this one is another really good option to kind of factor in if you're trying to choose colors that might be a nice complement to any of the other lines. So let's talk for a minute about how to combine colors and kind of choose which colorways you want to work with. If you look at these two here, the reason I chose these two, although they look really different when you just look at them in the ball like this, they have some similar kind of tones in them, and they're just varied in how saturated they are or how much white is added to them. So this Pegasus colorway is obviously a lot lighter and brighter overall, but that's what I liked, is that it added a complement to these darker shades of similar colors, and it really worked out well to create a gradient that had a spectrum in each color. So I kind of looked at it and said, all right, we have some red here, and orange and peach are kind of in the similar family as red. They're just the brighter version. And then we have a really nice kind of emerald green here, and then here we have a bluish green that feels like a cousin of that. So that was a really nice complement. And then there's a nice dusty purple in the Warlock, and there's also some purple variety in here. So when you're doing this, that is one approach to take in figuring out how your skeins could kind of mix together. But it's also just kind of cool to combine like maybe two neutrals that have one pop of color. Like I think this one would work really well with a few of the different cake options because it has some good neutrals, but you could choose to combine it with a skein that has more grays and browns or more greens, and you could take it in that direction. So it's really varied. You can kind of apply the technique however you like. I tend to be a little bit more of a neutral person, but actually the overall effect of combining the more muted version and the brighter version created a gradient that I was really happy with. So in this tutorial, we're going to use this kitchen scale to weigh our yarn, and this is just an inexpensive version. I got it on Amazon for 10 bucks. I'll link to it right below the video, but this is so helpful in figuring out how much yarn you have of each color, and then therefore how many rows or rounds you can work in a certain color within your gradient. And this is just one of those tools. I actually use it all the time for crochet projects in weighing like how much yarn something took and therefore how much yarn I'll have left, or calculating yardage. Even if you're not a designer, I think this is so worth the investment in your crochet tool arsenal. But for this project, it's really valuable. And if you don't have one of these, all these techniques will still apply. You're just going to be able to be a little bit more precise if you have a scale to weigh your yarn. So the first thing we need to do is deconstruct our yarn cake to see how much of each color we have. And I found that the best way to do this is not to like peel off a chunk of yarn because it can get tangled when you're winding it up. So I just remove the label like this, find the end of the yarn, and then we're just gonna wind up little balls of it. And this process can be a little bit tedious, so I suggest putting on a good movie and setting aside a little bit of time where you know you're just gonna wind off these balls. And if you have several skeins of mandala and you're not exactly sure how much yarn you're going to need to use, I would wind off a few skeins, but maybe not all of them, because you may just find that it's more yarn than you need. I would kind of get a little bit of each color going, and then if you have a scale, weigh it and kind of use that to estimate with some of the other techniques I'm going to show you, and see how much more you need to wind off to get the colors that you want. So now I'd like to show you something that's really important in making sure you get the gradient that's as nuanced as possible. And if you look at this here, we have a little bit of very bright red, and then we have a little bit of kind of a blended color that's sort of purple and sort of red. And you can see the color that came before that was the purple we just wound off. So as you're deconstructing your cake, it's really important to separate each color, even if it's kind of similar to the color next to it. So this, in my mind, is one color, then this is one color, and then this is a separate color. And what this allows us to do in the gradient is make sure we get the most subtle effect. So you can see here, there's kind of a little bit of tan here, and then there's some rows that are kind of like a blend of tan and mustard, and then we go into our fully saturated mustard. So if these were a part of this ball, they might accidentally end up like at the top of this gradient, or somewhere mixed in the middle where we're combining two balls. So we wouldn't want that. We have the most control if we separate out each particular color as we go. As you're winding off your balls, you might be tempted to just wind all of one color of all the skeins into one big ball. And the reason that I recommend against that is because what I've noticed is that in different skeins of mandala or any yarn, there might be a difference in the dye lot. So the same shade, the same purple in each skein might vary just a little bit. So you can see here, these purples represent the same spot in the skein on 3 different balls of yarn, but they are slightly different in color. So if I was making a gradient and had a purple section, I might choose, say if I wanted to make it darkest to lightest, I may choose to organize them something like that. But if they were in one big ball, I wouldn't have control over where the light color fell and where the dark color fell. So once you have a good bit of your yarn separated, then it's time that you can start sort of loosely mapping out your gradient. And in my opinion, this is the most fun part, but it is different than most other crochet projects you tackle because there's so much creative freedom in this part. So I know for some of us, for me, it felt a little stressful to be thinking of how much freedom there was. And I encourage you to try to keep this as lighthearted and playful as possible, because whatever you put together, it's probably going to look a little bit different once you actually crochet it, and it will look beautiful nonetheless. So when you're planning out your gradient, a few of the things to consider are different relative lightness or darknesses within a range of color. So like in this case, we have some mustard here. These 2 balls are pretty similar, but this ball is a little bit closer to tan. So I might choose to make this the bridge between a tan color and the mustard right here, or maybe a light peach color and the mustard here, because this is kind of a blended yarn that can help bridge that space in between 2 colors. And you can obviously use this technique regardless of what colors are involved in your skein, but in planning the gradient, my approach is to sort of look for colors that look like they would naturally be next to each other in a color wheel. So that means that I took a look at like this green looks like it's pretty different from this blue. But then I had some other bluish greens that sort of were a nice blend between the two. So I put them in that order. And then something like blue is a pretty natural companion to purple. So I did my purples with the thought of like, this is the darkest looking, sort of like it's saturated with a bit more blue. And so I went from here to the darker purple. And because that was so saturated, I knew I needed to work my way to the far brighter, less saturated purple. And so to do that, I did a couple rows of this slightly less saturated kind of grape color, and then some dusty purple into the brighter purple. And you can see that not every transition is necessarily the most obvious or organic. Like, these two don't really blend naturally into each other, but the reason I chose to put these by each other is because they're a similar level of saturation. So one tip that I heard once about combining yarn is to take a black and white photo of the colors you have, and then that can show you how much contrast there is in it. And so if you look at this, if it were black and white, there's not a ton of contrast between these two because they kind of blend well because they have a similar level of saturation. So that's what made me pair these two together. And this looks a bit dusty, which kind of looks like it's blending in with the purple. And then I moved on to mustard, which again has a similar saturation level to this pink, and then it lightened up to peach at the top. And I kind of thought of this, I was sort of inspired by like a lot of the colors of the American Southwest. And I thought of this almost like a sunset where you see the darker colors at the bottom, maybe the mountains, and then it lightens up and gets brighter at the top. Because if you'll notice down here, there's a spot where I didn't do this very well. And you know what? The sweater still looks beautiful. It all worked out okay. But if I had this, if I was sort of photoshopping this, I would do this differently. And that is that this really kind of dark, dusty color, this row ended up right next to the lightest purple. And that is not really ideal. Ideally, this row would have been down here, and then it would have blended to this and then to the lighter purple. But this was a case where I didn't do a very good job separating my colors. And so I reattached a ball right here, not realizing that in the very middle of the ball, I was gonna end up with a very dark shade of purple and then need to fasten on my next row of light purple. So that's why we wanna keep our colors as separate as possible in the balls. It's really up to you to think about the nature of the pattern and how you want it to kind of take on this rainbow form and how vivid or muted you want it to be, and then work with the colors that you have in your yarn cakes. So in just a second, I'll show you how I sort of take my rough idea of what I want the gradient to look like and translate it into more of a pattern for myself so that I don't have to think about it and refigure it out every couple rows. But first, I'd like to show you how we need to figure out the weight of one row in your pattern. And this is going to be slightly math-ish, but I don't want you to be deterred. This is really helpful sort of general crochet knowledge, and being able to do this is going to be really critical in being able to kind of fine-tune your gradient and know exactly what to expect from the amount of yarn that you have. So we're assuming now that you're working a pattern that's like a rectangle or a square or something with pretty consistent row length. And we're gonna work the first 3 rows of that pattern. Whatever it is, whatever the stitch is, work the first 3 rows using the color of yarn that you want to start your gradient or your rainbow with. So in this case, I'm working a pretty small swatch just for the example, but you'll probably have a much longer piece than this, which is good because the weight calculations will be a little bit more specific. This is so light, it hardly registers. But you're going to work those first 3 rows, and then we're going to put them on the scale. I'm going to show you how I do it here with a bowl, because your piece, because it's usually bigger, you don't want it like falling off the edge. So what I usually do is use a bowl like this. And if you remember from like high school science class, when you have something you're weighing and you don't want to count the weight of the bowl itself, you're going to push tare on your scale, and that's going to eliminate the weight of the bowl. So that takes us back to 0. That's really critical to have your scale at 0 when you start. And I have mine set to grams here. I find that to be the most useful metric to measure by. So then I'm going to put this in here, and it says that it weighs 3 grams. And like I said, you're probably gonna have a piece that's much bigger. So you might have something that weighs 8 grams or 12 grams or whatever it is. But for our example, we're gonna say this is 3 grams, and that's okay because what we wanna do now is take that weight and divide it by 3. So it's very easy because we have 3 divided by 3 is going to equal 1 gram. So that means that each one of these rows is using 1 gram of yarn. Now obviously the flaw in the example is that we don't know, because the scale is not that detailed, we don't know if it's like 1.25 grams or 1.1 grams, and that might matter in your gradient, but most likely you'll have enough yarn that you kind of have some room to play in it. So we're going to call this 1 gram per row. And again, if you're crocheting the Remix cardigan, I have a worksheet that makes this super straightforward because it shows the calculation, gives you kind of a space to write in each number and divide it. So it's very straightforward how to create your gradient. So if that's definitely worth the couple dollar investment to buy the ad-free printable PDF and get that worksheet. And again, you can find that linked right below the video. But regardless of the pattern you're working, now that you know how much one row of your crocheting weighs, now you can take a look at how much yarn you have in each color and map out your gradient accordingly. So from here, I kind of created that loose idea of what I wanted my gradient to look like before. So now I can get a little bit more specific by measuring how much yarn I have in certain colors. So here I have quite a bit in this one. I have 25 grams. So according to that little example I did, I could work 25 rows in this color. Now I might not want 25 rows. I might know I only want 17 rows and then I want to switch to the next color. So then I would weigh all the colors and see, okay, that is 25 grams, but this one, the next lightest color I want, it's only 7 to 8 grams. So I can only plan to do 7 rows in this one. So now I'm going to show you exactly what I do to plan out my gradient using the example worksheet from the Remix cardigan. And what I like about doing this is that once it's figured out, once the math is done, then I can sort of set my brain to autopilot and just crochet the day away. So again, if you're interested in having the calculations to do for your color gradient and you want just step-by-step written instructions that are very straightforward, the color planning worksheet in the Remix cardigan PDF is really helpful. And part of what that includes is this planning worksheet right here, which shows you exactly all the rows. I didn't print every picture to show you here because it would definitely not fit on the screen, but to show you all the rows that you need to work, and then you can kind of plan your yarn accordingly and map out how many rows of each color you're going to work. So then the worksheet tells you like where you're going to stop for what section of the pattern depending on the size you're making. And as you can see here, what I did to plan mine is take a little piece of yarn for each color I wanted to use and tape it down based on how many rows I plan to use of it. So for example here, my rows weighed 5.75 grams. So with the amount of yarn I had and I knew how much green I wanted to use, I had enough to work 2 rows. So I planned to use that green for the first and second row. Then I knew I wanted to switch to the slightly different greenish teal color on row 3 and work 2 rows like that. And if you notice here, these colors look almost identical. They're very slightly different. But it's important when you're planning to be really deliberate about what order they go in, because otherwise you're going to end up with that kind of purple example I showed you where you're going from darker to lighter and then oops, all of a sudden you have like a darker chunk right there. And it's not the end of the world. I think it kind of helps add to like the hand-dyed look of this, but the point is to sort of deliberately plan out what order you want these to go in. So then you'll see on a page like this, if you have a whole bunch of purple, you might do very subtle changes for 3 rows like this, and then you're going to work maybe a bunch of rows in the color purple that you have a lot of and you want that to be a prominent part of your design. So whether or not you're working the Remix cardigan, I suggest making kind of a map like this for yourself, because what's awesome about it is once you finish it, you can just sit down on the couch and say, okay, at these rows I know I'm switching color, but other than that I'm basically just mindlessly crocheting, which these days is my favorite thing to do. So I can't wait to see how you use this technique to make your own crochet projects, and I'd love it if you tag me on Instagram so I can see what you've made. I'm at Make and Do Crew, and go ahead and follow me there so you don't miss out on all my future free crochet patterns and tutorials just like this. Thanks so much for watching, and happy crocheting!